A woman walks into an airport, expecting nothing more than a routine flight. But what happens next will shake the entire airport to its core. When Dr. Maya Johnson, a successful black businesswoman, asks for help with her luggage, she's met with open disrespect. A staff member refuses to assist her, dismissing her without a second thought. Moments later, he rushes to help another passenger, someone who looks different from Maya. What he doesn't know is that Maya isn't just another traveler. She holds a power that could change everything. As tensions rise, a hidden camera captures the entire exchange. The footage spreads like wildfire, and within hours, the airport is thrust into a scandal it can't escape. What follows is a battle for accountability, a reckoning that exposes a deep-rooted problem, and a shocking revelation that will leave everyone stunned. But what happens when the tables turn? And can a man who once refused to change find redemption when the entire world is watching? This is a story about power, consequences, and the fight for real change. Hit subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss a second of this incredible journey. Dr. Maya Johnson walked into the airport terminal, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Dressed in a tailored black suit, she exuded quiet confidence. She pulled her large suitcase behind her as she approached the customer service counter, her eyes scanning the area for assistance. A man in a navy blue airport uniform, his name tag reading Jake, stood near the baggage drop-off area. He was helping a woman load her luggage onto a trolley, smiling as he chatted with her. Maya waited for a moment, expecting him to finish before she spoke. When he finally turned toward her, she gave him a polite smile. "Excuse me, sir. Could you please help me with my luggage?" Jake gave her a quick once-over, his eyes dragging from her expensive blazer to her deep brown skin. His lips curled into a smirk. "I don't help people like you," he said casually. "You can handle it yourself." Maya's smile faded. "Excuse me?" Jake shrugged. "You heard me." A few people in the crowd glanced at them but quickly looked away. No one stepped in. Just then, another woman, a tall, blonde traveler, approached with an equally heavy suitcase. Jake's expression immediately brightened. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he said enthusiastically. The blonde woman, Emma, hesitated, looking between Maya and Jake. "But she was here first." Jake chuckled and shrugged. "Not important." Emma frowned. But before she could say anything else, Maya took a deep breath and turned toward the customer service desk. "I'd like to speak to a manager," she said firmly. Within minutes, a man in a suit arrived. His name badge identified him as Richard, the airport floor supervisor. He listened as Maya calmly explained what had happened. When she finished, he let out an impatient sigh. "Ma'am, I think you're making a big deal out of nothing," Richard said dismissively. "Maybe Jake was just busy." Maya narrowed her eyes. "He helped someone else right in front of me." Richard crossed his arms. "Look, I don't want any trouble. If you have a complaint, you can file it through the proper channels." Maya held his gaze for a long moment, then pulled out her phone. "That won't be necessary," she said smoothly. She wasn't going to argue anymore. Instead, she started typing. A few feet away, a young man in a hoodie seated near the waiting area had been recording the entire exchange. His fingers moved swiftly over his phone screen. Within seconds, the video went live. By the time Maya put her phone back in her purse, the video had already reached thousands of views. And this was only the beginning. The video spread like wildfire. Within minutes, thousands of people tuned in to watch the livestream. The caption read, "Racism at the airport? Black woman denied help while others get VIP treatment." The comments poured in. "This is disgusting. Fire that employee immediately. How is this still happening in 2025? We need names. Let's hold them accountable." Meanwhile, inside the airport, Maya remained composed. She had seen this type of treatment before too many times. The only difference today was that the whole world was watching. A notification popped up on her phone. The video had already been shared over 50,000 times. Jake, oblivious to the growing storm, leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. When he noticed Maya still standing nearby, he smirked. "Still here?" he asked, arms crossed. "I thought I told you to handle it yourself." Maya exhaled sharply, keeping her temper in check. "I suggest you check your phone," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jake frowned, unlocking his screen. His feed was flooded with notifications. Someone had tagged him in the viral video. As soon as he played it, his face paled. His own words echoed back at him. "I don't help people like you." He swallowed hard. This was bad. Really bad. Richard, the airport supervisor, noticed Jake's change in expression. "What's going on?" he asked, walking over. Jake stammered, "Sir, it's online." He held up his phone, showing the viral video. Richard snatched the phone, scanning the screen. His face darkened as he read the comments. "Boycott this airline. Name and shame the manager too. Is this how they treat black customers? Unacceptable." His hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just a small complaint anymore, this was turning into a PR disaster. Suddenly, the airport's emergency intercom system crackled to life. "All customer service employees, report to an urgent meeting in conference room immediately." Jake and Richard exchanged nervous glances. That never happened unless something was seriously wrong. Maya watched them with a knowing smile. She had made a single phone call after Jake had insulted her just one. And now, the entire airport staff was scrambling. She took a step forward. "You may want to hurry," she said, her tone polite but cutting. "I believe this concerns both of you." Jake's heart pounded as he and Richard rushed toward the meeting room. Employees whispered to each other as they walked past. Some had seen the video already. Others were just finding out. By the time they reached the conference room, the atmosphere was tense. Several managers and staff members sat around a long table, their faces grim. At the head of the table stood the airport's regional director, Thomas Greer, a man known for having zero tolerance for bad publicity. He did not look pleased. Richard swallowed hard. "Sir, we can explain," Thomas cut him off. "Explain what? That your employee was caught on video discriminating against a passenger? That you dismissed her complaint like it didn't matter?" His voice was ice cold. "Or maybe you'd like to explain why this video now has over 1 million views and is being reported on by major news outlets." Jake's mouth went dry. 1 million views? This was so much worse than he had thought. One of the executives turned his laptop toward them. On the screen, a national news website had just published an article. "Airport faces backlash after employees' racist behavior goes viral." Below it was a still frame from the video. Jake's smug expression captured mid-sentence as he dismissed Maya. Richard clenched his fists. "Sir, this is being blown out of proportion." Thomas slammed his hand against the table. "Blown out of proportion? We're facing calls for boycotts. Sponsors are pulling their advertising. And do you know what the worst part is?" He pointed toward the door. Everyone turned as it swung open. And there she was. Dr. Maya Johnson walked into the room, her posture regal, her eyes sharp. Thomas straightened his tie, clearing his throat. "Dr. Johnson," he said formally, "thank you for coming." Jake blinked in disbelief. "Doctor?" Maya stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "It's interesting," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "When I asked for basic assistance, I was treated as if I didn't belong here. But now that the world is watching, suddenly everyone wants to listen." The room fell silent. Thomas cleared his throat again. "Dr. Johnson, I assure you, we are taking this matter very seriously." Maya held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I'm sure you are." Then she turned her gaze toward Jake. "You work for an airline, yet you judged me before knowing who I was," she said. "Tell me, Jake, do you know who owns this airline?" Jake hesitated. His stomach churned. The CEO, I guess?" Maya smirked. "Yes. And do you know who the primary investor is?" Jake shook his head. Maya tilted her head. Me? The room collectively gasped. Jake's knees nearly buckled. Maya folded her arms. That's right. You refuse to help a woman who owns the very company that signs your paycheck. Silence. Pure, unforgiving silence. Jake couldn't breathe. Thomas turned back to him, his jaw tight. Jake, he said flatly, I think you know what happens next. Maya didn't say another word. She didn't need to. Jake's world had just come crashing down. And this was just the beginning. Jake could feel the blood draining from his face. His mind raced, trying to grasp the severity of what had just happened. Dr. Maya Johnson, his victim, was the airline's primary investor. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was career suicide. Richard, the floor supervisor, looked just as pale. His earlier arrogance had vanished. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact with Maya. Silence stretched across the conference room like a noose tightening around their necks. Thomas Greer, the regional director, exhaled sharply and turned to Maya. Dr. Johnson, he said carefully, what would you like to see happen next? Maya leaned forward slightly, her fingers interlocked on the polished table. What I'd like, she said, is for this airline to be held accountable for the systemic discrimination I experienced today. Because let's be honest, this isn't just about Jake. Jake swallowed hard. She wasn't wrong. Maya continued, her voice unwavering. Had I been anyone else, someone without influence or resources, this would have been brushed aside. I would have been just another black woman told to deal with it. But today, that cycle ends. Her words carried weight, and they landed heavily on everyone in the room. A tense pause followed. Then Thomas nodded grimly. Effective immediately, he said, turning to Jake, you are suspended pending further investigation. Jake's heart pounded. Sir, please, Thomas held up a hand, cutting him off. Save it. Your actions have caused irreparable damage to this airport's reputation. The legal team is already involved. Jake's stomach twisted. Legal team? Maya's expression remained unreadable, but she tilted her head slightly. Actually, I have a different proposal. Everyone turned to her. I don't believe in simply firing people, she said. It's too easy. It doesn't teach them anything. Jake dared to hope. Maybe he wasn't finished yet. Maya met his eyes. I propose this. Jake keeps his job under one condition. Jake nodded rapidly. Yes, I'll do anything. Maya's lips curled into a slight smirk. You will enroll in an intensive diversity and customer service training program. One that I will personally oversee. Jake hesitated. Training? That didn't sound so bad. But Maya wasn't finished. For the next 3 months, you will exclusively serve passengers of color, she said. You will assist them with luggage, book their flights, handle their concerns. And every week, you will write a reflection on what you've learned. Jake's hope evaporated instantly. He wasn't being saved. He was being forced to confront his own bias day after day. Maya leaned back, crossing her legs. Refuse and you're fired. Accept, and you have a chance to redeem yourself. What will it be? Jake felt all eyes on him. He knew the PR disaster this had become. If he refused, he'd be blacklisted from the industry. If he accepted, he'd have to face everything he had tried to avoid. Jake clenched his jaw. He had no choice. I accept. Maya nodded approvingly. Good. Then your training starts now. She stood up, smoothing her blazer. But understand this, Jake, this is not just about you. This is about fixing a system that people like you perpetuate. If I catch you slipping up even once, you're out. Jake nodded stiffly, his throat too tight to speak. Maya turned to Thomas. Now about the rest of your staff. Thomas visibly tensed. Rest of the staff? Maya arched an eyebrow. You think Jake is the only one guilty of this? The room stiffened. Several employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Maya smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. I've already received multiple reports from current and former employees about racism within your ranks. So, we're going to fix that too. A soft knock at the door made everyone turn. The door swung open, and a team of lawyers stepped inside. One of them, a sharp-eyed black woman in a navy blue suit, stepped forward. "Dr. Johnson," she said smoothly, handing Maya a folder. "We have enough evidence to move forward with a class action lawsuit against the airport for racial discrimination." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Richard shot out of his chair. "Lawsuit?" he sputtered. "This is ridiculous." Maya simply flipped open the folder. "Your own employees disagree," she said, holding up signed statements from staff detailing years of discrimination. Jake's situation suddenly seemed minor compared to what was happening now. Thomas rubbed his temples. "Dr. Johnson," he said carefully, "what do you want?" Maya closed the folder. "Change," she said simply. "Real, lasting change. You will implement anti-racism training across all departments. You will audit your hiring practices. And you will publicly acknowledge that this airport has had a problem, one that you are now committed to fixing." Silence. Then Thomas exhaled and nodded. "Done." Maya smiled. "Good." She glanced at Jake one last time. "And as for you," she said, "I hope you pay attention during training." Jake knew there was no escaping this. He had made his choices. Now, he had to live with them. As Maya turned to leave, the door swung shut behind her, sealing the fate of everyone in that room. And just outside, in the bustling airport terminal, a new era was about to begin. The airport was in chaos. News stations had picked up the story, and reporters were already gathering outside. Hashtags like "Justice at the Airport" and "Hold them accountable" were trending worldwide. The airline stock had taken a sudden dip, and customers were furious. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Employees whispered in hushed tones. Managers paced nervously, taking frantic calls from corporate. Passengers watched the unfolding drama, their phones capturing every moment. And in the middle of it all, Jake stood frozen, absorbing the full weight of his actions. The diversity training started immediately. A special instructor, a former civil rights advocate named Marcus Tate, arrived that afternoon to lead the sessions. He was an older black man with silver hair and a no-nonsense attitude. As soon as he walked into the meeting room, he scanned the faces before him, most of them unwilling, uncomfortable, and unprepared. He locked eyes with Jake. "So you're the one, huh?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I made a mistake," he muttered. Marcus chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "A mistake? Boy, this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is dropping a coffee cup. What you did was a choice." Jake swallowed hard. Marcus dropped a thick folder onto the table. "Before we begin, let's take a look at the damage done." He clicked a remote, and a large screen behind him lit up. A live feed of social media reactions appeared. One post showed a black family stating that they had been ignored at the same airport last month. Another passenger described how they were once detained for looking suspicious while traveling for work. "This isn't new," Marcus said, his voice calm but sharp. "Dr. Johnson was just the first person with power who made you all pay attention." Jake's stomach twisted. The next slide displayed an internal complaint document one filed by an airport employee 3 years ago. The complaint detailed racist incidents from multiple staff members, including managers. The document had been ignored. Richard, the airport supervisor, stiffened in his chair. He recognized the form. He had dismissed that complaint himself. Maya, sitting silently in the back of the room, finally spoke. "Tell me, Richard," she said coolly, "how many of these complaints have you actually addressed?" Richard's throat went dry. I don't recall." Maya smirked. "That's interesting because my legal team found over 50 of them. And guess what? Every single one was either ignored or buried." Gasps filled the room. Even employees who weren't involved in the scandal looked horrified. Marcus folded his arms. And you wonder why we're here today? Jake clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to defend himself, say that he wasn't as bad as Richard, that he wasn't the worst one in the room. But deep down he knew that was just an excuse. He had been part of the problem. Marcus tapped the screen, pulling up a final slide, the airline's official response statement, hastily drafted by corporate. We at Skylux Airlines take these allegations seriously. We do not condone discrimination of any kind and are committed to reviewing our policies to ensure all customers are treated with dignity and respect. Maya scoffed. That's it. Thomas Greer, the regional director, sighed. Dr. Johnson, we are handling this as best we can. Not good enough, Maya interrupted. This is not a PR inconvenience. This is about real people being mistreated every day. And if you think a lazy statement will fix this, you're dumber than I thought. Thomas flinched. Then tell us what you want, he snapped, frustration creeping into his voice. Maya smiled, but it wasn't friendly. I already told you. Real change. She pulled out a document and slid it across the table. This is a legally binding agreement. If you sign it, you commit to mandatory anti-racism training, a new complaint system, and external audits on your hiring and promotion practices. Thomas picked up the document, skimming it. His face darkened. This is the extreme. Maya tilted her head. Is it? Silence. Thomas looked around the room. Employees stared back at him, waiting. Some of them looked hopeful, as if, for the first time, something might actually change. And then there were the lawyers watching, ready to tear the entire company apart if he refused. He exhaled and grabbed a pen. As the ink dried on the signature line, Maya nodded. Now we're getting somewhere. An hour later, an official press conference was held. Thomas Greer stood before a wall of cameras, sweat forming on his brow. Behind him, Maya sat composed, her expression unreadable. We at Skylux Airlines acknowledge our past failures, Thomas said, his voice steady but careful. We take full responsibility for the discrimination that has taken place within our airport. Today, we commit to lasting reform. Flashes from cameras illuminated the stage. Reporters shouted questions, demanding details. And what about the employees involved? One journalist asked. Maya leaned forward. They will be held accountable, she said simply. Behind the scenes, Richard received his termination letter. Jake, however, had a different fate. He was now under direct supervision, his every move monitored. His customer interactions were recorded. His training was publicly documented, ensuring he had no way to fake his progress. And the very next day, Jake was assigned his first customer under the new program. A black woman. She approached the counter, her luggage slightly too heavy for her to lift alone. Jake's hands trembled as he stepped forward. This time, there was no hesitation. Ma'am, he said, his voice different humbled. Let me help you with that. The woman gave him a curious look but nodded. Thank you. Maya, watching from a distance, smirked. Change wasn't instant, but it had begun. Jake felt the weight of the suitcase as he carefully lifted it onto the conveyor belt. It wasn't just the physical strain, it was the pressure of every eye in the airport watching him. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to stay calm. The black woman he was assisting glanced at his name tag, then back at him. She had likely seen the viral video. Thank you, she said, her voice neutral. Jake swallowed. You're welcome, ma'am. It was a simple exchange, but to him it felt like a test. A test he couldn't afford to fail. Across the terminal, Maya watched the interaction with sharp eyes. She didn't believe in instant redemption. One good action didn't erase years of bias. But she had to admit it was a start. News of the airport's reform spread fast. Other employees, now terrified of being the next viral scandal, started behaving differently. Luggage handlers, who once ignored minority passengers, now rushed to assist them. Customer service reps double-checked their attitudes before responding to complaints. But not everyone was happy about the change. Jake noticed the glares from some of his coworkers. A few of them employees who had once laughed at his racist jokes now acted distant. One of them, Brian, muttered under his breath as Jake walked by. "Sellout." Jake paused, his jaw tightening. "Excuse me?" Brian smirked. "You think playing nice is going to save you? You think Maya actually cares? She's just humiliating you." Jake clenched his fists. "I don't have a choice." Brian scoffed. "Sure you do. You could have walked away, but instead, you let her turn you into her little PR puppet." Jake's blood boiled, but before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Or maybe he's finally learning." Marcus Tate, the civil rights advocate and training supervisor, stood nearby, his gaze locked on Brian. Brian stiffened. "I'm Marcus, step closer." "Let me be clear," he said. "If you've got a problem with treating people with respect, then you're the problem." Brian's smirk vanished. He muttered something under his breath before stalking off. Jake exhaled. Marcus turned to him. "You good?" Jake hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. Marcus chuckled. "That's the first honest thing you've said all week." Later that day, Jake stood at the check-in counter when he spotted a familiar face. Emma, the blonde woman from the first incident. She smiled when she saw him. "Jake, right?" He nodded. "Yeah." Her eyes softened. "I saw the press conference. Looks like you've had a rough couple of days." Jake let out a short laugh. "That's an understatement." Emma glanced around, lowering her voice. "Can I be honest?" Jake braced himself. "Go ahead." "I almost walked away that day," she admitted. "I saw what you did to Maya, and I knew it was wrong. But I didn't say anything because, well, I didn't want to get involved." Jake felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Guilt? Recognition? Emma bit her lip. "And that makes me just as bad, doesn't it?" Jake didn't know how to answer. A week ago, he would have said no. But now, "I think," he said slowly, "that we all have a choice. We either stand by, or we step up." Emma nodded. "Then I want to step up." Jake raised an eyebrow. "How?" Emma smiled. "By making sure no one ever feels the way Maya did. If I ever see something like that again, I won't stay silent." For the first time in days, Jake felt something unexpected. Hope. The next morning, Jake received an email. Subject: Final. Evaluation. Report to conference room B. His stomach churned. He knew what this meant. When he walked into the room, Maya was already there, along with Marcus and Thomas Greer, the regional director. Maya gestured to a seat. "Sit." Jake obeyed. Maya folded her hands on the table. "You've completed your initial training. You've served passengers with respect. But tell me, have you actually changed?" Jake hesitated. I think so." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Think?" Jake exhaled. "I know I have." Maya leaned forward. "Prove it." Jake blinked. "How?" She slid a piece of paper toward him. "Sign this." Jake looked down. It was a public statement drafted for him to post online. It read, "My name is Jake Reynolds. A few weeks ago, I engaged in an act of racial discrimination that hurt not only Dr. Maya Johnson, but countless others who have faced similar treatment. I was wrong. I was ignorant, and I take full responsibility. Today, I am committed to being better, learning more, and ensuring that no one else experiences what I put Dr. Johnson through. To those I've hurt, I am sorry." Jake's hands shook slightly as he picked up the pen. He could walk away. He could refuse. He could tell himself that he'd done enough. But that would be the easy way out. Jake took a deep breath, then signed his name. Maya studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then your probation is over." Jake blinked. "Just like that?" Maya smirked. "Not quite." She handed him a new name tag. Jake frowned, turning it over. His eyes widened. "Jake Reynolds, Diversity and Inclusion Officer." He looked up, stunned. "You're promoting me?" Maya stood. "I'm giving you a chance to fix what you helped break." Jake swallowed. I won't let you down. Maya's expression softened just slightly. I hope not. As Jake left the room, his old self felt like a stranger. Because, for the first time in his life, he understood what real change looked like. And this time, he was ready to be part of it. Jake stared at the name tag in his hands. Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Just a week ago, he wouldn't have even understood what that title meant, let alone imagined himself wearing it. Yet here he was standing in the middle of an airport that had once been his playground of arrogance, now expected to be its agent of change. The weight of responsibility pressed against his chest. But something unexpected happened. For the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't feel resentment. Instead, he felt purpose. Jake's first official day in his new role started at 7 a.m. His job was simple: observe, document, and report instances of discrimination or bias in customer interactions. His supervisor? Maya Johnson herself. She wasn't making this easy for him, and he didn't expect her to. The morning went smoothly until he walked past gate 14 and saw a familiar scene. A middle-aged black man in business attire stood at the counter, speaking to a white male employee named Daniel. His voice was calm, but his expression was tense. Jake slowed down, listening. I told you, Daniel was saying, barely concealing his irritation, there are no available upgrades. You should have booked earlier. The customer frowned. I just saw you upgrade the last passenger. Daniel let out a sigh. That was different. Jake froze. This was it. A few days ago, he wouldn't have even noticed the problem. He would have walked by without thinking twice. But now he saw exactly what was happening. Jake took a deep breath and stepped forward. Hey, Daniel, he said, keeping his voice neutral. Daniel turned, clearly surprised to see him. Oh, Jake. What's up? Jake glanced at the customer. Would you mind if I spoke to my colleague for a moment? The man nodded, stepping aside. Jake lowered his voice. Do you realize what you just did? Daniel rolled his eyes. Come on, Jake. Don't start with that bias stuff. There really aren't any upgrades left. Jake folded his arms. Then, why didn't you check before saying no? Daniel hesitated. I just assumed. Jake didn't blink. You assumed because he's black? Daniel's mouth opened, then shut. He swallowed. Look, I didn't mean you didn't mean to get caught, Jake corrected. But you did. So now, you have two options. One, you actually check for available upgrades. Or two, we take this to HR and you explain why you're selectively enforcing policies. Daniel's face paled. He quickly turned to his computer and started typing. A few seconds later, he cleared his throat. There's actually one upgrade available. Jake nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Daniel swallowed hard. He knew he had just dodged a bullet. Jake turned back to the customer. Sir, my colleague has found an upgrade for you. We apologize for the oversight. The man studied Jake carefully. You the same guy from that viral video? Jake tensed. Yeah. The man smirked. Guess people can change after all. Jake exhaled. I'm working on it. And for the first time, he meant it. Later that evening, Maya called Jake into her office. He sat across from her, feeling like he was about to be graded. She leaned back in her chair. I heard about what happened at gate 14. Jake stiffened. Am I in trouble? Maya tilted her head. What do you think? Jake hesitated. I think I did the right thing. Maya nodded. You did. Relief flooded him, but she wasn't done. But one good act doesn't erase the past, she continued. You're on the right path, Jake, but don't expect applause every time you do the bare minimum. Jake swallowed. That stung, but he knew she was right. Maya studied him for a moment. Tell me something. Why are you really doing this? Because you have to, or because you want to? Jake didn't answer right away. He thought about Brian calling him a sellout. He thought about the glares from old coworkers. He thought about Emma, admitting she had stayed silent when she should have spoken up. And then he thought about that man at gate 14, how for a moment he had been just another Jake to him. I don't want to be that guy anymore, Jake admitted. The guy who stands by and does nothing. The guy who makes people feel like they don't belong. Maya's eyes softened, just slightly. Good answer. She slid a folder toward him. Jake picked it up, frowning. What's this? A new program I'm launching, Maya said. It's called the Legacy Project. I'm selecting a few employees, people who genuinely want to be part of the solution, to lead workshops, mentor new hires, and develop better training policies. I want you in it. Jake's breath caught. You want me to help teach others? Maya nodded. Who better to educate people about change than someone who had to learn it the hard way? Jake's fingers tightened around the folder. I don't know if I'm ready. Maya smirked. That's the thing about growth, Jake. You never feel ready. But you do it anyway. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Jake nodded. Okay, I'm in. Maya leaned back. Good. Then let's get to work. By the end of the week, the airport had undergone a transformation. The new anti-discrimination policies were officially rolled out. Staff were required to attend monthly training sessions. An anonymous reporting system was implemented, making it impossible to bury complaints. And Jake, for the first time in his life, he had a purpose beyond himself. He still had a long way to go. He still had to prove himself not just to Maya, but to every person who had been on the receiving end of his past behavior. But now he wanted to. As he walked through the terminal, his new name tag pinned to his uniform, he caught sight of another black traveler struggling with her luggage. And without hesitation, he stepped forward to help. Maya, watching from a distance, allowed herself a small smile, because change wasn't about words. It was about actions. And Jake was finally learning that lesson. The airport felt different. It wasn't just the new policies or the mandatory diversity training. It was the energy. Employees who once ignored complaints now paid close attention. Passengers who had experienced discrimination in the past were now greeted with respect. And at the center of it all was Jake Reynolds, the former face of the scandal, now attempting to rebuild his reputation one action at a time. It had been a few weeks since Jake accepted his role as diversity and inclusion officer. Some days were easier than others, but the doubt lingered. Do people really believe I've changed? Am I actually making a difference? The true test came one afternoon at the check-in counter. Jake was processing passengers for an international flight when a black woman approached, her young son holding her hand. She looked exhausted, her large suitcase dragging behind her. Good afternoon, ma'am, Jake said, offering a polite smile. Checking in for Flight 372? She nodded, barely meeting his eyes. Yeah. Jake quickly entered her details, but when he glanced at her son, something felt off. The boy looked tense, his small fingers gripping his mother's sleeve. Then, Jake saw the way she kept glancing at his name tag. It clicked. She knows who I am. Jake's stomach twisted. This wasn't just any passenger, this was someone who had seen the viral video. Someone who had seen him. And she didn't trust him. Jake couldn't blame her. As he printed her boarding passes, he hesitated. Ma'am, if there's anything I can do to make your trip smoother, please let me know. She finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. You really mean that? She asked. Jake nodded. Yes, I do. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I saw the video. I know what you did to that woman. Jake's grip on the paper tightened, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. I was wrong, he admitted. I can't take it back, but I can do better. I am doing better. The woman's expression softened slightly. Then, she gestured toward her son. We've had bad experiences before. People treating us differently at airports. I just don't want him growing up thinking that's normal. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly and the generations learning from them. He crouched slightly, so he was eye level with the boy. "I want you to know something," he said gently. "You deserve to be treated with respect always. And if someone ever tells you otherwise, they're wrong." The boy blinked up at him, then turned to his mother. She exhaled slowly, then gave Jake a small nod. "Thank you," she said. Jake handed her the boarding passes, watching as she walked away. For the first time since this all began, he felt like he had truly made a difference. Later that evening, as Jake was finishing up his shift, he spotted someone familiar near the departure gates. It was Emma. She wasn't flying anywhere, just watching. Curious, Jake walked over. "Didn't expect to see you here." Emma turned, smiling slightly. "I wanted to see for myself if this whole redemption arc of yours was real." Jake smirked. "And?" Emma shrugged. "I think you're trying, and that matters." She hesitated, then crossed her arms. I've been thinking a lot about that day. About how I just stood there." Jake nodded. "I get it. It's easier to stay silent than to risk confrontation." Emma exhaled. "But that's the problem, isn't it? Good people staying silent is how this kind of thing keeps happening." Jake looked at her closely. "Are you saying you want to do something about it?" Emma nodded. "Yeah, I don't just want to be a bystander anymore." Jake thought for a moment, then smirked. Maya's launching the Legacy Project. Maybe you should be a part of it." Emma raised an eyebrow. "You think she'd even consider me?" Jake chuckled. "Maya doesn't care about what you were. She cares about what you do now. And if you're serious, you should talk to her." Emma was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "Maybe I will." For the first time in a long time, Jake felt something strange. Pride. Not for himself, but for the people around him who were also choosing change. As Jake walked through the terminal, his phone buzzed. A message from Maya. "Conference Room C. Now." Jake sighed. No rest for the reformed. When he arrived, Maya was already seated, reviewing reports. She didn't look up. "How do you think you're doing?" Jake hesitated. "Honestly, better than I expected." Maya finally met his gaze. "And why do you think that is?" Jake took a deep breath. "Because I stopped focusing on proving people wrong and started focusing on proving people right." Maya smirked. "Smart answer." She slid another folder across the table. "Your final evaluation." Jake opened it, scanning the document. His probationary period was officially over. His title, Diversity and Inclusion Officer, was now permanent. Jake exhaled. "So, I made it." Maya tilted her head. "You made it this far." Jake smirked. "That means you're stuck with me now." Maya chuckled. "We'll see." She stood, extending a hand. "Congratulations, Jake. But remember, this isn't the end of your journey." Jake shook her hand firmly. "I know. It's just the beginning." As he left the conference room, the airport around him felt brighter somehow. Because change wasn't about one moment. It was about a lifetime of choices. And for the first time, Jake was ready to make the right ones. Jake had always believed that change was a slow process, something that took years, if not decades, to truly take hold. But now, standing in the middle of the airport, watching the effects of his actions ripple outward, he realized something profound. Change doesn't start with a system. It starts with a choice. One choice. The choice to speak up. The choice to do better. The choice to unlearn and rebuild. He had made his choice. Now it was time to see if others would do the same. As Jake walked through the bustling terminal, he spotted a commotion near the security checkpoint. A young black woman, probably in her mid-20s, was arguing with a TSA officer. "I told you I don't have anything else in my bag," she protested, her voice laced with frustration. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stiff posture, folded his arms. "Ma'am, we need to conduct additional screening." Jake immediately noticed something. A few feet away, a white man had just walked through the same checkpoint with an identical bag and wasn't stopped. Jake's pulse quickened. He had seen this before. He had been part of this before. But now, he had a job to do. He stepped forward. Is there a problem here? The TSA officer turned, eyes narrowing. This doesn't concern you. Jake flashed his new ID badge. Actually, it does. I'm with the airport's Diversity and Inclusion Office. I'd like to understand why this passenger is being pulled aside when others, with the same luggage weren't. The officer hesitated. It's standard procedure. Jake raised an eyebrow. Really? Because I just watched you wave 3 other passengers through without issue. The woman's frustration turned into cautious hope as she looked at Jake. The officer shifted uncomfortably. Look, I'm just following protocol, then let's check the protocol, Jake interrupted. If additional screening is necessary, then it should be applied consistently. Otherwise, we have a problem. Silence stretched between them. Then, begrudgingly, the officer stepped back. Fine. She can go. The woman let out a breath of relief. Thank you, she said to Jake. He gave her a nod. Safe travels. As she walked away, Jake turned to find Marcus Tate watching from a distance. The older man smirked. Not bad, kid, Marcus said, walking over. Jake exhaled. That was my first real confrontation. Marcus patted his shoulder. And you handled it like someone who actually gives a damn. Jake chuckled. That's the goal. Marcus nodded. You keep this up, and you'll be the one training new hires soon enough. Jake's stomach flipped at the thought. Training others? Teaching them how to recognize discrimination? A few weeks ago, the idea would have seemed ridiculous. Now it felt like the next step. Later that evening, Jake sat in a conference room with Maya, Thomas Greer, and a few other executives. They were reviewing reports on the first month of the airport's new policies. The results were mixed. Complaints about racial discrimination had decreased by 30%, but reports of passive resistance from employees had increased. Some staff members were openly defying the new policies, dragging their feet on implementing changes. This isn't surprising, Maya said, flipping through the reports. Racism doesn't disappear just because you issue a policy. People resist because they think they're losing something. Thomas sighed. So what do we do? Maya tapped the table. We double down. She turned to Jake. This is where you come in. Jake straightened. Me? Maya nodded. You've earned respect from some of the staff. And you've made enemies. That means you have their attention. Now, you need to show them that this isn't just a temporary phase. This is the new standard. Jake exhaled. So, what exactly do you need me to do? Maya smiled. Lead a workshop. In front of everyone. Jake's stomach dropped. Led? He had only just begun learning himself. Now, he was expected to teach others. I don't know if I'm the right person, he admitted. Maya raised an eyebrow. Why not? Jake hesitated. Because I'm still learning. Because I still feel like I have a lot to make up for. Maya leaned forward. That's exactly why you're the right person. People don't need perfection, Jake. They need someone who's been where they are and who made the choice to change. Jake let that sink in. She was right. His voice wasn't valuable despite his past mistakes. It was valuable because of them. Slowly, he nodded. All right. I'll do it. A week later, Jake stood in front of a packed conference room. Employees filled every seat, some curious, some skeptical. Among them was Brian, the coworker who had once called him a sellout. Jake took a deep breath. This isn't a lecture, he started. I'm not here to tell you that you're a bad person or that you should feel guilty. Silence. Everyone was listening. I'm here because I was just like you. I used to think that as long as I wasn't using slurs or being aggressive, I wasn't part of the problem. But the truth? Ignoring injustice makes you part of the problem. Standing by while someone is mistreated makes you part of the problem. Brian shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Jake continued. I don't expect anyone to change overnight. But I do expect you to think about this. What kind of person do you want to be? The one who stays silent? Or the one who speaks up? More silence. Then, slowly, people started nodding. Even Brian looked deep in thought. Jake exhaled. This was only the beginning. As the session ended, Maya walked over. "You did well," she said. Jake smirked. "Think I have a future in this?" Maya chuckled. "I think you might just surprise yourself." As Jake left the room, he realized something. Change wasn't about what he had done in the past. It was about what he chose to do next. And for the first time, he was ready for whatever came next. Jake walked through the airport, feeling the shift in the air. It wasn't just the new policies or the mandatory workshops. Something deeper was changing. Employees who once turned a blind eye now hesitated. Passengers who would have been ignored were being treated with more care. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Because for every person willing to change, there were still those who resisted. And today, Jake was about to face one of them. Jake was heading toward Gate 22 when he spotted an argument at the customer service counter. A black man in his mid-40s stood with his arms crossed, speaking to an airline employee. His expression was calm, but his body language showed frustration. Jake recognized the employee immediately. Brian, the same coworker who had called Jake a sellout. Jake quickened his pace, catching the conversation mid-sentence. Brian sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sir, I already told you. We can't upgrade you to first class." The passenger frowned. "Then why did you just upgrade that other guy?" He pointed to a white man who had been at the counter less than a minute ago. Brian scoffed. "That was a different situation." Jake stopped in his tracks. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was deliberate. Jake had a choice, the same choice he had ignored in the past. This time, he wouldn't stay silent. He stepped forward. "Brian," he said, his voice level, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Brian turned, his face tightening when he saw Jake's official badge. "Not now, Reynolds." Jake didn't budge. "Now." Brian let out an exasperated sigh and stepped aside. "What do you want?" Jake glanced toward the passenger, then lowered his voice. "What's going on?" Brian crossed his arms. "It's none of your business." Jake exhaled sharply. "It is now." Brian scoffed. "Oh, I get it. You think you're better than me now, because you're Maya's little project." Jake held his ground. "I think you're about to make a mistake that could cost you your job." Brian's jaw clenched. The guy wasn't eligible for an upgrade. "Did you check?" Brian hesitated. Jake narrowed his eyes. "That's what I thought." Brian exhaled, rubbing his face. "Look, I didn't mean, but you did," Jake interrupted. "You assumed. And that's exactly the problem." Brian looked away. "Whatever, man. It's not like anyone actually cares." Jake's patience snapped. "I care." Brian frowned. Jake took a deep breath, lowering his voice. "Do you know why I took this job? Because I saw who I used to be in the mirror, and I hated it. I don't want to be that guy anymore." Brian's eyes flickered with something guilt, maybe. Jake pressed on. "You think calling me a sellout makes you better than me? It doesn't. It just means you're too afraid to look at yourself." Brian's shoulders stiffened. Jake gestured toward the passenger. "You can fix this, Brian, right now. Or you can double down and end up exactly where I was on the wrong side of the story." Silence. Then, slowly, Brian turned back to his computer. He typed something, swallowed hard, then looked at the passenger. "My apologies, sir," he said, his voice stiff. "It seems there was an oversight. There's an available upgrade after all." The passenger gave Brian a long, unreadable look before nodding. "Thanks." As he walked away, Brian turned back to Jake. His expression was unreadable. "Happy now?" Jake shook his head. "Not happy. Just glad you made the right choice." Brian exhaled sharply and walked away. Jake watched him go, knowing that Brian wasn't fully there yet, but he had taken the first step. And sometimes that was enough. Later that evening, Jake found Maya sitting in her office, reviewing reports. "Got a minute?" he asked. Maya didn't look up. If it's about Brian, I already know. Jake sighed. Then you know he almost refused that upgrade. Maya nodded. I also know he didn't. Jake sat down across from her. What if he's just doing it because he's afraid of getting caught? Maya smirked. So? Isn't that how you started? Jake hesitated. Maya folded her arms. You didn't wake up one morning and magically become a better person, Jake. You changed because you had no other choice. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about consequences and started being about who you wanted to be. Jake exhaled. So you think he'll get there? Maya leaned back. I think that's up to him. Silence stretched between them. Then, Maya's smirk faded into something more serious. Do you know why I gave you this job, Jake? Jake hesitated. Because you wanted me to make up for what I did. Maya shook her head. No. I gave you this job because I wanted to see if people like you could really change. Jake swallowed. And Maya studied him for a moment. Then, finally, she nodded. You're proving me right. Jake felt a lump in his throat. He had spent weeks earning her respect, and now he finally had it. Maya slid a folder across the table. One last thing. Jake opened it, his eyes widening. It was a proposal for a permanent department focused on diversity, inclusion, and ethical customer service. His name was at the top. Jake looked up. Are you serious? Maya nodded. This isn't just about you anymore. You've done the work. Now, I need you to help lead this for real. Jake's hands tightened around the folder. A few months ago, he would have laughed at the idea of being part of something like this. But now he couldn't imagine doing anything else. He met Maya's gaze and nodded. I'm in. Maya smirked. Good. Because this is just the beginning. Jake took a deep breath, knowing she was right. Because breaking the cycle wasn't just about calling out discrimination. It was about ensuring it never had the chance to start again. And he was ready. The sun was just beginning to set over the airport, casting long shadows across the terminal floor. The place that had once felt suffocating to Jake now felt different. Not perfect, not fixed overnight, but different. And for the first time, he was part of that change. The next morning, Jake stood in front of a packed conference hall. It was the official launch of the Diversity and Inclusion Department, and every employee, from baggage handlers to high-ranking executives, had gathered. Maya stood beside him, arms crossed, a slight smirk on her face. You ready? She murmured. Jake exhaled. Guess we're about to find out. She stepped aside, allowing him to take the podium. The murmurs in the room quieted as Jake scanned the crowd. Among them, he saw faces he recognized, some supportive, others skeptical. Brian sat near the back, arms crossed, watching him carefully. Emma sat near the front, nodding encouragingly. And Thomas Greer, the regional director, was seated beside Maya, waiting to see if Jake was really worth the investment. Jake cleared his throat. 3 months ago, he began, if you had told me I'd be standing here today, I would have laughed in your face. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. 3 months ago, I was part of the problem. I made assumptions about people based on their appearance. I ignored what was right in front of me. And when I was called out for it, I thought I was the victim. The room was silent now. But I was wrong, Jake admitted. And the truth is, a lot of us have been wrong. Some of us have ignored complaints. Some of us have stayed silent when we should have spoken up. And some of us have convinced ourselves that as long as we're not racist, we're not responsible for what happens around us. He let his words sink in. But the truth is, we are responsible. Because every time we let something slide, we tell the world that it's okay. Every time we look away, we let the cycle continue. A few heads nodded in the crowd. Even Brian's arms weren't as tightly crossed as before. Jake took a deep breath. I used to think change was impossible, that it was too big, too slow, too exhausting. But then I realized it starts with one choice. He scanned the room. So today, I'm asking all of you, what choice will you make? Silence stretched for a long moment. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. Jake turned, surprised to see Marcus Tate in the back, nodding as he applauded. Then Emma joined in. Then others. Within seconds, the room was filled with applause. Maya watched with a knowing expression. Jake exhaled, letting the moment settle. This wasn't about applause. This was about what happened next. After the meeting, as people filtered out, Jake gathered his notes, preparing to leave. A shadow fell over him. Brian. Jake straightened, unsure of what to expect. Brian hesitated, then stuffed his hands into his pockets. Look, Ma, I don't say this often, but I might have been wrong about you. Jake smirked. Might? Brian rolled his eyes, but let out a small chuckle. Fine. I was wrong. Jake nodded. That mean you're signing up for the training sessions? Brian exhaled. Don't push it. But then after a pause he added, maybe. Jake grinned. That's a start. Later that evening, as Jake was finishing up his work, Maya walked into his office. You did well today, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Jake shrugged. Not bad for someone who was almost fired 3 months ago. Maya chuckled. Not bad at all. She stepped forward, placing a folder on his desk. Jake frowned, flipping it open. It was a promotion, offer a full-time leadership role in the Diversity and Inclusion Department. His breath caught. You serious? He asked. Maya nodded. I don't waste my time, Jake. You've proven you're ready for this. Now the only question is, do you want it? Jake looked at the folder, then at Maya. For the first time, he didn't hesitate. I do. Maya smirked. Then welcome to the team officially. A week later, Jake stood near Gate 14, watching as passengers boarded their flights. A black woman approached the counter, struggling with her bag. Jake didn't wait. He stepped forward, lifted the suitcase with ease, and smiled. Let me help you with that. She looked surprised but nodded. Thank you. As she walked away, Jake glanced around the terminal. The airport wasn't perfect. There were still people resisting change. Still moments where bias crept in. But it was better than before. And it would keep getting better one choice at a time. Because that's how change happens. Not through grand gestures. Not through forced apologies. But through the future we choose to build. And Jake had finally made the right choice. This story isn't just about one man's redemption. It's about all of us. Change starts with a choice to speak up, to listen, to learn, and to do better. Every day, we all have the power to break old cycles and build something better. So now we ask you, have you ever witnessed discrimination? How did you respond? What does fairness and respect mean in your part of the world? Where are you watching from? Comment your country below. If you believe in stories that inspire, challenge, and push for a better world, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can create change one story at a time.